I'm Max Clark. We help companies buy and optimize IT services. If you work with us, in addition to helping you through the selection process of what technology addresses a problem, pain, or objective that you have with your business, we're also going to help you go through the contract negotiation of what terms you should and should not have. And I'm going to tell you our secret right now because you should just know these things. What are the things that we always negotiate, always look at in contracts? And by the way, when I say always negotiate, always is not an absolute. It's not 100%. There's cases that we don't. Sometimes, like, you just know that you can't get things out of this. For instance, if you are signing a contract for a $400 a month internet circuit at your office, you don't have a lot of negotiation capacity with that service provider. They're not going to spend 30 hours with your lawyers negotiating that contract. There's stuff that you can get, and there's stuff that they have a standard language that doesn't appear in their contracts that you can ask to have added because it's addendums. And by the way, that's the other secret. Most service providers have standard addendum language that you can just ask for if you know what you're asking for. And if you know the secret password, you can just say, hey, I need blah, 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 blah. And they'll just be like, hey, no problem. And they'll just give it to you. First thing we look for when we want to understand and negotiate, right? What is your notice period on that agreement? A contract will be structured. It'll have an initial term. Let's call it 36 months, 3 years. It'll have an initial term. And at the end of the initial term, it's going to have a renewal term, right? So there's two things that run in tandem. There's two things, right? There's the renewal term, renewal language, and the notice period, right? So these become the first things that we really talk about. So is your agreement going renewing? And you're going to see three variations of this language. You're going to see language that's going to say it renews for a subsequent term of equal length to the initial term. 3-year contract renews for 3-year terms. Don't sign that. You can have one that says it auto-renews for 1-year terms. So a 3-year contract then ends up becoming 1-year term renewals. Or your third option, a lot of people want, into the initial term, it's going to go month to month. Also with this is, what is your notice period? So in order to terminate the agreement and not go into the auto-renewal, you have to tell the provider in a certain mechanism. Again, this also is important. Is it an email? Is it a ticket? Is it a certified letter? Is it a FedEx? What is the mechanism before this timeline? Right? Default language is going to say 90 days. It's important. If you've got a 36-month contract that then renews for annual terms and you want to get out of it, you have to make sure that they receive your notice 91 plus days out. Common technique for this, and this is a little crazy, or it sounds a little crazy, it's actually kind of genius. Sign the contract, establish service, and then the next week, send them the termination, right? Like, you don't have an auto-renewal threat now, right? Because you've already terminated the agreement at the end of the initial term, right? It's also great. There's other stuff with that, and I'll talk about this later. Now, depending on what that provider is providing, is selling you and how they're buying it. Are they reselling or aggregating another service? That's going to influence also the notice period that they have, because maybe they can't give you 30 days because they have a 30-day notice with their underlying provider. And so there's no way to get to that mechanism. So part of this is understanding what you're dealing with on the other side to understand how far you can push. So maybe they've got a 30-day notice, so that way you can push your notice down to 45 days, from the 90 days. That way you've got, they've got 15 days to react and provide, terminate whatever underlying infrastructure they're providing to you. Okay. By the way, byproduct of going month to month with a lot of providers, the language will include the ability for them to re-rate you to current term or current month to month rates. So just be aware of that. It might be worth it for you to not be in any sort of term and pay a higher rate, or maybe the renewal rate, the month to month rate is so much higher that it makes sense for you to reterm. So this is something that we actually go through and we'll provide some guidance on as part of our renewal processes. Okay, so renewals, notice, ETFs. By the way, you'll see ETF, ETL, early termination fee, early termination liability. Every single agreement will say this is not a penalty, it's a blah, blah, blah. There's like all sort of legal mumbo jumbo that goes into this actual section. What you want to understand here is what the language is from that service provider. If you terminate early, what happens? Default language from a lot of providers are going to say that you owe them 100%. You terminate a month 2, it's a 36-month contract, you owe them 34 months worth of service out the door. Now, as a side note, I will tell you, I've litigated an agreement like this beforehand, and the judge in that case actually came back and said that having 100% ETF is an invalid provision, and immediately whacked that down from 100% to a lower percentage threshold. Just understand, if you're getting all the way to that point with something, 100% actually isn't 100%. It's going to be something under 100%. So at one end, you have 100%. Like the high level, it's going to say 100%. One of the nice things about dealing with phone companies, an ILEC, incumbent local exchange carrier, regional bell operating company, the phone company, is the phone companies and their regulatory oversight will have a default of 50%. So if you sign a contract with a phone company, read the fine print on that agreement. That fine print says that the ETF is going to be 50% of the remaining term. It's actually a phenomenal ETF in the grand scheme of things. 50% exit, early is a great ETF. The third version of this that you're going to see is somewhere in between. It could say 100% of year 1, 80% of year 2, 50% of year 3 plus, and some sort of tiering up and down. You're going to want to first understand what situation you're in. Then you're going to want to understand what situation can you be in. Again, If that service provider is reselling somebody else, what are they reselling to you? If that service provider is reselling something to you and they have a 50% ETF on their contract with their underlying infrastructure provider, they're not going to give you less than 50%. There you can get away. You don't need to negotiate 100%. And by the way, there's margin on that, so you can infer what you want. And I think we see this a lot, especially with more sophisticated service providers, is you can go and you can push back and say, hey, we're not going to accept 100% ETF on this agreement. And that service provider might come back to you and say, hey, that's no problem. We completely understand. Here's options for a shorter term. We price this at 36 months. But here's pricing for 24 and 12 months. If you want to negotiate this language, we don't negotiate this language, just select a different term. You don't want to sign 36 months, pay a higher fee for 12. It's completely on you. That's also on the table. So you should understand, is that on the table? Is that not on the table? What are you actually dealing with? Okay. Something that you're going to want to know and document and keep track of, and something we keep track of, is what is your actual service start date? It's not when you sign the contract. It is when the service actually starts, when the service goes into place. So your service order might say your service start date is when the service actually goes active. It could say when it goes active, or it's this other date. It could be fixed to a specific date. It could say we're going to do installation for you, and then you have to do acceptance. And if you haven't accepted by this date, it goes active on this date unless you accept it early, beforehand, right? There's going to be some trigger that actually defines what your service start date is. And by the way, that trigger for your service start date is really important because that's the actual date that then is your end of service date, which then also details when your notice date is. I've only seen this once, but pay attention to this. Calendar days versus business days. 90 business day is very different from a 90 calendar day situation. So pay attention to that one as well. SLAs. What's an example? If you got a data center, doing a data center deal, you're going to see SLAs in a data center deal. It's going to define humidity thresholds, temperature thresholds, air circulation threshold. And those are all good things to have. It's good to have a threshold that says, the data center is going to give you conditioned cool air and the temperature in the cold aisle is not going to exceed this number, right? So that way you can do planning against it. Same thing with a network. A network provider is going to give you an SLA that's going to say, by the way, the SLA is going to be very limited. It's going to say that some threshold within their network is going to have a certain jitter or a certain latency target. And that could be the CP installed at your location to their POP, or it could be POP to POP. There's going to be different things, and depending on what service you're buying, it's going to have different targets with these things. Just to be clear, that threshold that you're getting by default in these SLAs is giving that service provider a decent amount of padding. Your service should be much better than that. And maybe you want to negotiate that SLA down. Maybe you don't. It's going to be very situationally dependent on what you're actually doing and what you're trying to achieve. The master service agreement will incorporate by reference the service level agreement. And so you end up with this stacking, right? Where it's you sign a service order. That service order will have a service addendum with service specific terms. That service addendum, and the service order and the service addendum, then will stack on top of the master services agreement. Master services agreement will then refer to a service level agreement, maybe an acceptable use policy, maybe a facility access policy. There might be other things built into it as well. But the MSA by default is going to have language, and the language is very specific. It's going to say your sole remedy for interruptions, service-related issues is the SLA. And then you're going to read through the SLA, and the SLA is going to define all this stuff. And some SLAs are huge. I've seen SLAs that are, pages and pages and pages and pages and pages of documents, all sorts of stuff. And then the SLA is going to define things that are going to say, if we exceed this threshold for this amount of time, you get a credit of this much money. And, if we violate our blank, you get a credit of this much money. And if we have an outage for blank, you get, credit, based on this duration, you get a credit for this much money. And those are all great. By the way, the SLA is also going to say that in order to get the credit, you have to notify them. You have to open a ticket during the event that has to be validated by them. And then you have to request the SLA. And if you don't open the ticket and then request the credit for the SLA, you don't get the credit for the SLA. It's a proactive thing that you have to do as a customer. Now, this is probably the area that we spend the most amount of time on for our customers. Not negotiating the SLA and the SLA targets. Not what the credit amounts are. Not changing the credit definition that says your maximum credit for a given month can be 1 day's worth of service, which is typically what you'll see. It's adding the right to terminate the contract without penalty for violation of the SLA under either a chronic outage event or a long duration event. If you have a service provider that has an outage for over a certain duration of time, depends on what it actually is, I believe that you should have the right to cancel that contract. If you have a network outage for 5 days, it's pretty reasonable for you to be able to say, hey, we're going to cancel this contract and we're not going to pay the ETF to do it. If you don't have that language in the SLA, you do not have that right. Almost more annoying than a really long duration outage is a chronic outage. You have a service provider that every third day of the week has an outage for 45 minutes. That maybe wouldn't trigger your initial threshold of a credit with them because it was only 45 minutes, but now they've had 45 minutes, 45 minutes, 45 minutes. Maybe it's even less than that. Maybe it's 15 minutes, 15 minutes, 15 minutes, but it's consistent. And by the way, massively disruptive. Take any part of your IT infrastructure and just say it's going to be unavailable for you randomly for 15 minutes every 10th day for 2 months. Like, what does that do for your operations? Like, your cell phones just go down, your email goes down, your internet goes down, your application goes down, your CRM goes down. Pick a thing and just turn it off randomly. Getting language added to the SLA specifically to give you the right to terminate the agreement without penalty in the event of a chronic outage or a long duration outage is the single best protection that you can get added to this agreement when you're engaging with a service provider. It is the only thing that's going to really hold the service provider to delivering service to you, because a service credit is a very weak penalty when it really comes down to it. Even if your service credit accounts for and gives you a month worth of free service, it's still a relatively weak penalty for them. What else do we put into these things? Installation guarantees. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. Usually you won't, because a service doesn't start billing until it's installed. So there's no guarantee from the service provider to meet any sort of installation window. By the way, if you're dealing with a salesperson from any service provider and they tell you, oh yeah, it's going to get installed, like, how long is it going to take to get installed? And they're like, oh yeah, we're going to do fiber optic construction and trenching, and we're going to have this thing installed for you. And like, no problem. It's going to be like 2.5, 3 weeks, They're just lying to you. And they're lying to you because once they get that contract signed, they know they don't have to deal with you anymore because it goes to a different department within that company. They get their quota, they move on to the next sucker. The only installation guarantee that's worth anything is, again, the right to cancel. By the way, a lot of agreements will give you a default right to cancel if certain conditions are met within that contract, or when I say not met, the service provider decides it's going to be excessively expensive for them to install. They can come back and say, we thought we could do this for this rate, but we have to install a new telephone pole and it's going to cost $10,000 and we have to increase your charge. You can just say, hey, no problem, we're out. That's defined in most cases. But having an installation guarantee and a right to cancel if that guarantee is not met is usually valuable. And if you've got a salesperson promise you an installation timeline, you want a financial guarantee, not a credit. Ask for a financial guarantee. You want a penalty added to the agreement, not a credit. You want cash and a check mailed to you. You will not see that. And it's a really quick way of sussing out people that actually have guarantees or don't have guarantees. Last thing here, really quickly. Check your service orders and change orders. When you sign new service orders and change orders, understand if you're reterming the service. I have seen, and there are people that have great brands, there are companies with great brands that seem like wonderful companies and have really crazy language written into change orders and service orders where you'll go and say, hey, I need to change the service. Not like install new service, but make a change to an existing service. And if you don't read the fine print, when you sign that order and you request, and maybe it's just a ticket, when you submit that ticket, you request that change, you are reterming your service. Or you'll see variations of this that say, when you sign a new service order for new service, the existing services co-term with the new service being ordered. So you might think that you've got old services that are out of term or coming out of term, and you like executed a change order, a service order for something else, and then they come back and they're like, oh, by the way, all of your services retermed, and you're like, excuse me? Look for that as well. These are things that we do in process. We have a checklist. We go through it. It doesn't take you a lot of time. You can have your lawyers go through and figure out where the commas and semicolons should be, and work on reps and warrants and indemnification and everything else that you're going to want to have in or not have in there. But from what you actually are going to care about in that contract, if something goes wrong, these are the things that you need to cover, and these are the things that we always look for with our customers as we go through our contract review process. If I missed anything, you got any questions or stuff that you've seen, comment below, let me know. I'd love to read it. I'm Max Clark. Hope this helps.
Feel it.